Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As you're well aware, the title of my presentation this evening is really the German occupation of the Channel Islands and the effect of the disruption to the mail service. The Channel Islands were occupied by German forces on the 1st of July 1940. And from that point on, there was no direct mail service between the islands and England, or the United Kingdom. However, just before then, it was agreed in Guernsey, at least, that most of the school children should be evacuated to England. And obviously parents came with them as well. And therefore parents and babies also came. And I show on my first picture here, a cover from Devon addressed to St. Martin's. But fortunately, when I got it, the actual letter was inside. And the letter was actually from an evacuee who had just arrived in England from Guernsey to her grandmother still in Guernsey. She posted this on the 27th of June 1940, but by then the mail service was obviously then by mail steamer had stopped, and therefore this was returned to sender and never got to Guernsey. The actual letter was part of the letter was requesting that her gran came over to England as well to join them, but that was too late. But you can see where I put the red bar. They had a terrible time on the crossing. It took over a day on the boat from Guernsey to England, which is incredible. And she said there were 200 to 300 babies and mothers. It was awful. We stayed up all night cutting up bread and opening tins of corned beef. What a start to your time in England. Another cover here was sent from the stamp dealers and catalogue dealers, Whitfield King. This was addressed to a guy in Alderney, and it was sent on the 29th of June 1940. And again, well, two things here. Alderney, being close to the French mainland, was totally evacuated, and the post office was therefore closed. We'll come back to Alderney a bit later in my talk. But we here see a service suspended hand stamp in the centre of the cover, and it was returned to Whitfield King. Because it was sent at printed matter rate, the sender's Whitfield King had to pay a penny postage due for return to sender. However, a lot of people still didn't realise that they couldn't send mail direct to the islands. And here I show an item from the Legal and General Insurance Society in London, addressed to a lady in Gloucester Street, St Helier. It was to confirmation of her fire insurance arranged. She had moved some of her furniture into London, which probably wasn't a good idea, but no, the censor had said that no commercial mail could be sent to from England to the islands anyway, although no mail actually got through. But the censors put this sticker on it, PC23, saying return to sender by the censor. England, obviously, there are a lot of evacuees in England from Guernsey, and they wanted to write back home to their relatives saying that they were safely in England and where they were staying, etc., etc. And they believed that they could send mail direct to the islands via the forwarding agents Thomas Cook in Lisbon. Here we get a cover. This would have been included the message inside it. It was sent to Lisbon, and Thomas Cook staff then posted it on to Jersey with a Portuguese stamp. And you can see the Lisbon date stamp alongside. This got as far as, well, it went through Madrid, it went through most of France, and it ended up in Cologne, where the Germans censored it. And you can see on the left-hand side the censor label for Cologne, code letter C, funnily enough. It then went on from Cologne back to Paris, but at that time there was no postal communication between Paris and the islands. And so it received a cachet, returned to sender at the top of the cover, an inadmissible cachet, and stayed in Paris for 5 years. And at the end, when France was liberated at the end of the war, it received the cachet détenu in France during the German occupation. So that system didn't work, although I believe one item of mail is recorded that got through. So eventually, the only way really for mail, for messages to get between the islands and England was via the International Red Cross. And here I show an example of a Red Cross message form sent from England to Jersey. First of all, they were only allowed 25 words, which you can see in the centre. This was sent in December 1940. The addressee is at the bottom, and this took roughly 6 weeks to in transit. It would have been routed via neutral Lisbon, from Lisbon to Geneva, from Geneva to Paris, where normally the Germans would censor it, and then on from Paris to Jersey. And this continued until the system continued until effectively D-Day. Following the liberation, well, after D-Day, hardly any messages got through at all. They got as far as Lisbon, and that's as far as they got. Following the liberation of Paris, they just held in Lisbon. And what they then did, a couple in the Red Cross Bureau in Lisbon just summarized them into a book. And on arrival in Guernsey, they were typed onto a small flimsy piece of paper, such as you can see on the right-hand side. And on the back of that was the actual address. So these messages were summarized down from 25 words down to 10. But because of the nature of these sort of flimsy pieces of paper, very few examples exist. These were carried, the messages were carried on the relief ship, the Vega. This was on the first relief voyage. The next relief voyage, the Guernsey system got their act together and produced special forms, inscribed summary of civilian messages held in suspense at Lisbon. And again, you can just see the short message at the bottom. The date of the messages was actually when it was sent on its way, but this wouldn't have got through until 1945. So again, nearly 10 months in transit. Going the other way, again, islanders in Guernsey thought on the first day the Germans would be very friendly and allow them to write to their loved ones in England, but no way. And especially when you look at the address on this particular cover sent from Guernsey, the regimental paymaster of the Royal Artillery in Leicester, the Guernsey Post Office postmarked it, then opened it, put a white label, sticky label on the top, and returned it to sender. Then they eventually thought, well, we might be able to get messages through neutral countries. So if we send a message undercover to Portugal, can we get it through? So they put a threatening stamp on, which was the correct letter rate, foreign letter rate at the time, and addressed it to the British Vice Consul Lisbon. It just didn't get any further than the Guernsey Post Office, this one, and it was endorsed, cannot be forwarded to destination. And again, it was returned to sender. Then in Jersey, messages were coming, Red Cross message forms were actually getting to Jersey by January 1941. They hadn't got their act together of sending special message forms out at that time, but they were allowed to write replies on the back of message forms from England. And you can see this one, which was sent out on the 13th of January 1941. It then went through the, well, effectively the Jersey Red Cross Bureau office, and they put on initially for the first 2 days of the opening of this office, a large double circle hand stamp in German inscribed Der Bailiff von Jersey, which the islands were horrified about, and it only was in use for 2 days. And again, from Jersey, it would do the reverse of what I've mentioned earlier on. It would go to Paris and then Geneva. And we can see on the left-hand side, the smaller double circle with the Red Cross in the center. That was applied in Geneva. And then it eventually went from Geneva via Lisbon to England. And we can see the octagonal past censor mark at the bottom of the cover, at the bottom of the message form. And here's one going from the other, here's one actual message form going from Guernsey. And as you can see, this is on a German style Red Cross message form addressed to London. Now, this is a bit sad one. It's addressed to an Osmond, Britain, care of the CI Refugees Committee. They hadn't a clue where it got to in England, so they just hoped that the Refugee Committee would have a list of all the refugees' addresses and they could send it on from there. And again, this was in transit for 6 months. Again, once Paris was liberated in 1944, the Red Cross message route couldn't go through Paris. First of all, it went through Nancy, and then in November 1944, the only way they could do it was to fly the messages out on what we call fortress flights, which also contain letters from the German troops back to their relatives in Germany. This was flown to Berlin. You can see a special censor mark at the top of the form in faint red on the top right. This was applied in Jersey, and then somehow it got from Berlin to England. Again, there's no other markings, no Geneva cachet. This was sent on the 17th of November 1944. My guess is that this didn't actually arrive into England until after liberation. Right, what happened with mail sending between the islands? The bailiwick of Guernsey comprises of 3 large islands. One we've mentioned, Alderney, which was totally evacuated. Then the Sark. Now, Sark has got a feudal government then that was called the Chief Pleas. And the leader of that government was called the Seigneur of Sark, and that was the famous Dame Sybil Hathaway. And here we've got 2 actual items, postcards, postal stationery cards from the Dame of Sark addressed to Guernsey. The first one is addressed to Smith Street, and it's a King George V penny postal stationery card, uprated with a penny arm stamp. We haven't really talked about stamps much so far. They were allowed to use British stamps or British postal stationery throughout the occupation, but obviously the penny was the standard unsealed letter rate at the time, so they used the lot of penny stamps, and those run out by Christmas 1940. For a short period while they designed and printed their own stamps, they decided to bisect twopenny stamps for a penny rate. So these are old penny postcards. The rate went up from a penny to twopence on the 1st of May 1940. The first one, you can see they're both signed by Dame Sybil Hathaway. The first one was a request for new curtains for the seigneury where she lived in Sark. The second was addressed to Boots the chemist. Her dog was not feeling well, so she needed some tablets for the dog. No mail between Sark and Guernsey was censored that I've seen during the occupation period. I've already mentioned that Alderney was totally evacuated. However, the German troops decided that, or the Germans decided that it was so close to France that they ought to build great concrete walls, etc., around Alderney. And so they sent initially a load of troops to start all the building work, but they hadn't got any food. So in 1942, the Guernsey Parliament, the Guernsey States, was requested to send a working party of young men out to Alderney to grow vegetables for the German troops. This only happened for 1942. This is a cover, unfortunately, but rather tatty. You can see the tear on the top right. It should be twopence halfpenny. A halfpenny stamp has gone. It's sent to a Mr. Toomey, who was one of the working party staying at Rose Farm, Alderney. And you can see on the back, it's got the word letters SWALK, sealed with a loving kiss, sent from his girlfriend. And they did actually, afterwards, they got married towards the end of the occupation. Inter-island mail, mail from Jersey addressed to Guernsey. Well, here's somebody again, hopefully thought on the 1st of July 1940, we should be able to send at least across from Jersey to Guernsey, but no postal service until the 13th of July. So this stayed in the post office in Jersey until the 13th of July in the hope of getting it through. It didn't, so they returned it to sender, endorsed no postal service. Here's an example. I mentioned the bisect a few minutes ago. Here's an example of the Tuppenny Centenary bisect. They're in use between the 27th of December 1940 and mid-February 41. Majority of these are philatelically contrived, but this is rather nice because it's addressed to the Feldkommandantur, or the German Civil Command in Jersey, and their headquarters was called College House. Generally, mail between Guernsey and Jersey and vice versa was not censored at all. I seem to have lost one here. But if you're lucky, you can find examples of censored mail. Here we've got a cover on the left, sent from Guernsey to Jersey, and it was routed via Paris, where it was censored. The reason may be in the address, Mrs. Lucas Shalom Millbrook. On the right-hand side, it was sent to a Mr. Knight in Samaray, Jersey, and again from Guernsey. And again, you can see on the back the German censor label, code letter X for Paris. The reason that one was censored, he had written a previous letter which was telling a lot about what some of the people were trying to do in Guernsey to his mate in Jersey. The Germans spotted that one, so they didn't like any of his future correspondence. The majority of mail, certainly family mail, or what I call personal correspondence, if it to be censored, was censored in Paris. However, newspapers, or what I call commercial mail, appears to be only censored in Frankfurt. There's very few examples of Frankfurt censoring. The left-hand one is just a newspaper wrapper, so they obviously wanted to open up and see if anybody put any secret messages within the newspaper. The second was from the manager of the Westminster Bank in Guernsey to the manager of the Westminster Bank in Jersey. And again, you can see on the reverse, the censor mark, again, code letter E for Frankfurt. This is a fun one. This was sent from Guernsey to Jersey in May 1943. Unfortunately, we have no content, so we don't know what it contained. It was sent with 5 halfpenny stamps of Guernsey addressed to First Tower in Jersey. But there's no British Examiner label, censor label on the left-hand side. So what is going on? Well, if you look on the reverse, which is on the right-hand side of this picture, you can see a red circular hand stamp. Now that looks to me like a German censor hand stamp, which would have been applied in Paris. Now, for some reason or other, the contents were pretty awful or pretty important that the Germans didn't want forwarded. So it was decided to hold the envelope and contents in Paris. Now, this was actually held in Paris until after the liberation of Paris and was eventually routed back to London. Although it was May 1943 it was sent. It got to London. The Examiner, Paris was liberated in September 44. It got to London, and again they looked at the contents and condemned it. So underneath the word Examiner on the left-hand side, you can see the word condemned. After the end of the war, they released it, and with a London postmark, and eventually got back to Jersey in 1946. So it took 3 years to get to its destination. Once Paris was liberated, obviously mail that needed censoring couldn't be censored in Paris. Here's a cover from Guernsey to Jersey. So the main censoring office was then in Jersey. And we see a cover here sent from Guernsey to Jersey. And when it arrived in Jersey, all they did was just reseal the envelope with brown tape. And you can see a very poor example of a censor hand stamp over that tape. Similarly here, we've got one going the other way from Jersey, April 1945, shortly before liberation in May 1945. Tuckney Halfpenny stamp for Jersey. Jersey had special views stamps printed in 1943 in Paris. You can see part of the brown censor tape on the back on the right-hand side, and you can see this very faint censor hand stamp on the front. So then we'll look at mail going from the islands to occupied Europe, or to Europe, sorry, not occupied Europe. First of all, to Ireland. Several islanders have got relatives in the Republic of Ireland. And again, this particular person in Jersey thought in August 1940 that he could send it to Ireland as it was a neutral country, etc., etc. But again, the post office rejected it, endorsed it no service, crossed the address out, and it was returned to sender. Another cover here from Jersey to Ireland, sent in November 1940. This was from Dr. Hannah, who was actually involved with the Red Cross Message Bureau in Jersey, to his brother, who was Mr. Justice Hannah. You can see the address, High Court of Justice in Dublin, but not even that high-powered address got it through. By November 1940, he obviously was aware of the Red Cross Message Service, but didn't really know how it operated. So he thought, well, if we put it via the German Red Cross at the top, or put it in German and French, hopefully it'll get through. But again, it's endorsed in blue crayon in return to sender. You can see it got to Granville, but that's as far as it got. December 1940, going the other way, Ireland to Guernsey. Well, this actually got through. It was censored, first of all, in Ireland. We see the pink censor label. It was then forwarded to London, where we see the censor label 4249 on the right-hand side. It was then forwarded via Lisbon, Spain, and Frankfurt. We get the Frankfurt censor tape, or censor label code E, on the back of the envelope, as you can see here. It arrived in Guernsey, but for some reason it was undelivered because there was no such address. So it was returned to sender, but of course at that time there was no service to return to sender. So we get, in addition to the undelivered for reason standard cachet, we get the no service cachet. This one actually got through, sent from Ireland to Guernsey in 1941. You can see the 3 Irish stamps, again the pink censor tape, and this was actually from Lady Shaw in Dublin to her daughter Anne de Putron in Guernsey. Most of the family correspondence between Lady Shaw and Mrs. de Putron is still in the de Putron family. I've got copies of it, but I'm not allowed to show it at the moment for some weird reason. Anyway, this got through and it was routed via Munich. How do we know it was Munich? Because we see the code letter D on the reverse and the code letter D related to Munich. This would have gone via Ireland, England, Lisbon, Spain, and Munich. So you can see what a tortuous journey it had got. No, not a direct service at all. Another one to Mrs. de Putron. Her husband was Cyril. Her name was Anne. This was sent in 1942, but this had a different route. It went from Ireland You can see the pink tape. To England, again, the Examiner this time 5129 label, and then via Lisbon, Spain and Bordeaux this time. It was opened by the Germans in Bordeaux, and we get the German censor label code letter Y for Bordeaux on the reverse of the cover. So again, a convoluted route to actually get to the islands. Another way of sending messages, maybe more quickly than that convoluted route, was via the Irish legation in Paris. Very few examples of this have been found. This was a message was sent from Ireland to Paris, and then when it got to the Irish legation in Paris were able to send it direct to Guernsey. So you can see on the right-hand side, this was sent from the message was retyped in Paris on the 8th of January. We get a Paris machine cancel for the 10th of January, and on the reverse of that envelope, we get the Guernsey date stamp for the 21st of February. So that was a quicker route to get mail through to the islands. Eventually, like England, they introduced the Red Cross message system, and the Irish message was printed on green paper. And this is a message from Ireland, from Kinsale to the guy that worked for Lloyd's Bank in Guernsey. And again, it would go the same route that I explained earlier. A more unusual route, this one is from Helsinki to Guernsey. Obviously, there are a lot of philatelists even still collecting happily during the war, and they'd obviously found out that Guernsey and Jersey had issued their own stamps, so they wrote to the head postmaster in Guernsey requesting some of the Guernsey stamps. Guernsey actually issued 3 different stamps, a halfpenny, a penny, and tuppence halfpenny. That was all they actually produced during the 5 years of occupation. This was sent from Finland. You can see the Finnish censor mark, a small double circle towards the middle of the envelope. It then went strange route via Lyon in France, then via Bâle in Switzerland, and eventually ended up in Guernsey. Mail from Holland to Guernsey and Jersey to Holland. Both of these were routed via Cologne. You can see the censor code letter C. These are both sent in 1941. And again, the left-hand one again is to the postmaster requesting stamps. Norway to Guernsey and Jersey to Norway. These were routed via Berlin. And again, on the left-hand side, it would be a request for stamps. I'm not quite sure what was happening on the right-hand side. It was a cover sent from Jersey to Norway. And the next thing we'll notice that for foreign mail, they had to use German stamps. They could not use the British or the locally produced stamps. There was one German field post office on Guernsey and one on Jersey, and the letter rate was 25 pfennigs. This was from a company of Jersey motor panels. I'd like to know what on earth they were requesting from Norway. Then at the end, as parts of Western Europe were getting liberated, that's even more interesting philatelically. Here is a registered cover sent from Belgium in March 1945 addressed to Jersey. Belgium was liberated, but by then Jersey was still occupied. And so this, you can see, it was routed via England. That was the obvious route to go. So we get registered markings for England, and they decide they couldn't get it any further. So eventually it was returned to Belgium, and you get this cachet returned to England without a reason for non-delivery. Eventually it got delivered back to Belgium in November 1945. So again, it did a round trip in 9 months. Then final section looks at just a few of the social stories. Young Bertram Mort was a member of the expeditionary force which arrived in France in 1940. And unfortunately, he was captured by the German troops and became prisoner of war. And he was forwarded to a camp near Cherbourg, prisoner of war camp in Cherbourg. Well, in August 1940, they certainly hadn't got the system going for prisoner of war mail or anything like that. So he thought, well, I'll still write to my wife. I've got an envelope, I've got some paper. So he duly did, wrote the address. I thought, well, I haven't got a stamp. So he put on the top right, in place of where the stamp should be, the letters PG, which is prisonnier de guerre in French for prisoner of war. It was then somehow smuggled out of the camp and got into a post box in Cherbourg. It got to the Cherbourg post office. It got the Cherbourg Manche machine cancel, and then they looked at the address. Couldn't send it direct there, because in August 1940, there was no direct postal service between France and the islands. So they put a cachet on it, inadmissible return to sender in French. However, it did get through. Somehow it sneaked out of the post office into a fisherman's boat and smuggled back into Jersey. Here's a story of a young Guernsey lady who in 1939 told her parents that I'm fed up with this boring island of Guernsey. I want to go and live in London. It's much more exciting, which she duly did. Fine. The only trouble was she fell in love with a German and married him. So once the war started in 1940, they were both sent to an internment camp in the Isle of Man. So this is a POW letter sheet sent from her in this POW camp in the Isle of Man to her mother in Guernsey, and it was routed via London, Lisbon, Madrid, Bordeaux, Paris. It says via Germany, but I think it actually went from Paris direct to Guernsey. You can see on it the Madrid hexagonal airmail date stamp, and then you can see the Bordeaux censor mark, code letter Y on the left-hand side, and then a little circular AX mark. This was just passed unopened by an examiner, X being again the code letter for Paris. So they got through, the message obviously got through. This is a sadder story. One of two letters recorded from Fort George Prison in Guernsey. It was from a policeman. He wrote one to his wife and one to his parents in May 1942. He was expecting 3 months imprisonment, but got a sentence of 9 months. What he was doing was the Germans apparently were acquiring a lot of food stores, and he was robbing. They were trying to rob the German food stores to feed the starving people in Guernsey. He unfortunately, after 8 weeks at Fort George, he was transferred to Caen prison in France, then on to Dijon prison, and eventually was hoping to be released on the 25th of November 1942. But they moved him to a Nazi sort of secret police prison, to the SD in Dijon in January 43. And he said, well, this is not good. I've been here far too long. So he wrote a letter on a small sheet of paper, which you can see here, on the 2nd of March, requesting his release, stating that he completed an extra 50 days extra imprisonment. You can see on the reverse of it, criminal police, Dijon. And surprisingly, they released him. Unfortunately, shortly after his release, both he and his wife were then sent to internee camps. A lot of islanders, especially those of British nationality, were sent to internee camps in Germany. He was sent to Kreuzberg in Germany, and his wife was sent to Compiègne And again, this is a scarce internee card from his wife in one camp to him in another camp. 1 month later, his wife was actually transferred to Kreuzberg, so they were together then until liberation in 1945. Vivian Milne, well, she and her family, I think most of the islanders during the occupation had got radios. The police had, the Germans had just gave up trying to confiscate them, I think. But the naughty thing here was they were typing out the information from the BBC News on the radio onto special news sheets and distributing them to the locals. Well, obviously one of the locals gave it away to the Germans and they got arrested. And Vivian Milne, who was a young teacher or teacher's assistant, was sent to the local prison, which was in 4 Gloucester Street. So although it looks an interesting address, it isn't. Unfortunately, the building doesn't exist today. Mail addressed to people in that prison should have been sent free of charge, so hence the stamps were not even cancelled. It was censored, and you can see the German censor in manuscript at the top left. She didn't stay there very long in the prison there. She then was moved to a prison in France, and we can see here a cover sent from France to her friend who was also a teacher in Jersey. And again, you can see that this was censored on the back. She was eventually released from that prison. She spent about 6 months there and came back to the islands. Then after the war, she went for a degree at Oxford University and became eventually a professor of English literature at Kent University, and she died in the 1990s. Then we come to the Harris correspondence. Well, Ron Harris was quite a character, and I think he was a used car salesman in London, and they got married in 1940, fine, but the problem was they decided to go to Guernsey for their honeymoon. They went to their honeymoon, literally a week before the Germans occupied the islands, and they were obviously there for a few extra days than a week, and they're looking outside the window of their hotel or guest house, and they could see the final mailboat leaving the islands with them still in Guernsey. So effectively they had a 5-year honeymoon in Guernsey, although I'm sure it wasn't a honeymoon. He got a job as a fireman in Guernsey, and here are the identity cards which were produced for them once they were in Guernsey. However, because they were of British nationality, they were sent to internment camps in Bibarak. They were both deported to the same camp, but here there were different barracks for men and women. So again, they couldn't see much of each other. This was a birthday card sent in 1944 to his wife saying many happy returns with pleasant memories of the past. Hope we'll get some years of enjoyment in the future. And the final one I'm showing here is the camp Bibarak has been liberated by May 1945, but the islanders were still there until sort of late June 1945. But by then, all he got was just an ordinary sheet of paper from a notebook, and at least he was able to say many happy returns of the day. This birthday has brought peace. May the next bring prosperity and a greater degree of comfort. And as you can see, he addressed it in a little envelope to Barrack 3, room 44, Bibarak camp, Germany. And whilst we're on May 1945, ladies and gentlemen, that completes my story. Thank you very much indeed.